Hello everyone, and welcome to the Autistica Research Festival. We'll be starting in 5 minutes. We're just going to give everyone a little bit of a chance to join us, and then we'll get started. Hi everyone, thanks very much for joining. We'll be starting in 2 minutes. We're just giving everyone a chance to join us. Hello everyone and welcome to the Autistica Research Festival. Thank you very much for joining. We're really excited to host this event fully online this year. I just want to say a huge thank you to you all for signing up in such great numbers and for your enthusiasm around the event and for adapting to this event being an online event. And also a huge thank you to Fujitsu for their support of this event and supporting us as we change to a fully online festival over a week instead of a one-day conference. So this is really an exciting event for us, and I want to say a huge thank you also to Beth and Davies, who has made this all possible and has fully transformed the event in such a short period of time. We're excited about this event because it's a real opportunity for us to think about autistic people, family members, other professionals and researchers to think about how autism research can improve the lives of autistic people and their family members. As an autism research festival, this is really about the discussion of ideas. So you'll be hearing things that you agree with, and you'll be also hearing things that you don't agree with as well. Just throughout that conversation, please do be respectful and adhere to our code of conduct, and that should hopefully make sure this is a pleasant and safe environment for everyone to discuss their ideas and to participate in. So the other thing that we have going on this evening is we also have an Autistica quiz. So if you're interested in a bit of a quiz after a day of research, please go to our research festival page and you'll find out more about that. So I'll now get on to introducing you to our keynote speaker for today, who we're absolutely delighted to have here with us today. It's Katie Maras, who is a senior lecturer in psychology and deputy director at the Centre for Applied Autism Research Centre at Bath University. Katie's interests lie in cognitive psychology, with particular interests in autism and eyewitness and forensic psychology. So Katie's work is funded by a number of funders, including the ESRC and British Academy, and much of Katie's work is really focused on how autistic adults think and might communicate differently, and how service providers can adapt to change and make their environments more accepting to autistic people. So today's topic is very, of course, related to those research interests, and will be on cognition in autism, implications for practice in the criminal justice system and beyond. So I will now hand you over to Katie, who will share her screen and get the presentation started.
Thank you, James. I hope you can hear me okay, because the screen... just want to start by saying a huge thank you to Autistica for inviting me to give this talk. It's a real honour. So I began research into this area when I began my PhD back in 2008 with the brilliant Dermot Bowler and the Autism Research Group at City University London, who are known for their
Hi everyone. So this is James here. So we've just lost Katie for a second. Thanks for all of you who are messaging on the chat screen. We'll just give Katie a chance to rejoin. Obviously, we're all doing this from home, so we're all relying on having reliable broadband, and so obviously Katie's broadband's unfortunately slightly failed her, but I'm sure she'll be back in a minute. So if you could just hold on for a sec, hopefully Katie will be able to join us again. Thank you so much for your patience. We'll be back in a second.
Okay, am I back?
You're back. Great, great.
Okay.
So, don't worry, these things are bound to happen. So if you just reshare your screen, and we can get started again.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Not
No.
yet.
Okay, hang on.
There we go.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Katie.
Okay, have you got the slides now?
We do. We do.
Good.
Well done. Thanks.
Okay,
Cheers.
I'm not quite sure where that cut out. Apologies for that. I was just explaining my kind of interest in this area began when I started my PhD back in 2008 with Dermot Bowler at the Autism Research Group at City University London, and the focus within this group is largely on memory. They kind of lead the field in looking at memory and autism, and my PhD research looked at how this translated into more applied settings, specifically in terms of eyewitness testimony. And this work kind of really highlighted that actually we need a lot more research in this area, because it showed that current police techniques which are developed for neurotypical individuals ultimately aren't effective for autistic people who recall events differently. So this kind of opened up sort of field for me to look at this in more detail and in sort of wider areas as well. So in this talk, I want to give an overview of some of the differences in memory and autistic cognition more broadly, and the implications that has for providing evidence in the criminal justice system, and also in wider areas as well, such as employment. So I'll start by outlining why we need to focus on the criminal justice system, and then give an overview of how differences in autistic cognition mean that traditional police interviewing models, as I said, which have been developed with neurotypical individuals in mind, are often inappropriate for autistic interviewees. And then next I'll outline attempts to adapt interviewing techniques with varying success for autistic witnesses. And then the last part of my talk will briefly consider some remaining challenges, such as issues around diagnosis, disclosure and credibility, as well as how this might apply for other individuals who encounter the criminal justice system, such as suspects and defendants, since most of the work to date has been around interviewing witnesses. And then, as I said, in further afield in areas such as employment. So why focus on the criminal justice system in the first place? Well, autistic people are more likely to encounter the criminal justice system. So, for example, one study found that as many as 20% of autistic youth had been stopped and questioned by police. Sadly, this can quite often be in relation to victimisation, for things like hate crime, exploitation, robbery, and so forth. In terms of offending, there's a kind of a mixed pattern, with some studies suggesting that a minority of autistic people may be more likely to engage in certain types of crimes, such as crimes against the person, such as sexual offences and assault, which may be related to difficulties and differences in social cognition and triggered by precipitating events as well, and sensory issues and so forth. But other studies actually report that autistic people are less likely to engage in other types of offences, such as property crimes, driving and drug offences, and even cybercrime, which I think there's a kind of stereotype around autism and cybercrime, but actually once you account for things like better IT skills, there's some evidence that autistic people may actually be less likely to engage in cybercrime. And other studies have found that autism may actually serve as a protective factor against offending. So I just kind of want to make the point that it's a kind of messy picture. Some studies suggest that there may be a certain increase in certain types of crimes, whereas others suggest decrease. And on balance, there's not really any increase in offending, but it's a kind of messy kind of picture. but also other reasons for coming into contact with the criminal justice system, such as seeking assistance, missing persons, and also being kind of picked up by police for reasons that are actually nothing to do with engaging in criminality, but just sort of alerting the attention of police for other reasons, such as behaving in a way that doesn't sort of fit within a neurotypical model, may alert sort of suspicions in some cases, so may end up being interviewed for those kinds of reasons. There was the case a while back of ZH, who was a boy who was taken to a trip to a swimming pool and became very transfixed by the water. The people running the swimming pool became concerned and called the police, who tried to restrain him because they thought he was about to start behaving aggressively. And he jumped into the water, and they dragged him out, restrained him, and that all led to, as you can imagine, a whole host of kind of negative knock-on events and effects after that. So there's kind of a range of reasons why autistic people may come into contact with the police, and we need to understand more about how we can support autistic people to provide their best evidence within that to ensure justice and ensure that they get the appropriate treatment and access to services that they require. So an emerging body of research is now coming out documenting autistic people's unfortunately largely negative experiences across various aspects of the criminal justice system, such as first response, custody, court and prison. So it's beyond the scope of this talk to go into all of these areas. I'm going to focus really on police interviews in this study, in this talk. So in 2016, we did a study looking at the experiences of autistic people who had come into contact with the criminal justice system, as well as the experiences of police officers who had come into contact with autistic people in their roles. And we found that their experiences with police procedures were largely negative, and this centred around a number of aspects of the police process, ranging from generally the treatment they received, the explanations they received, the adaptations and support that they often didn't receive, police knowledge and awareness, and also a particular area was interviews. And when we asked police about their experiences, again, they kind of highlighted similar issues in terms of a lack of training and awareness that would then enable them to make appropriate adaptations and support, such as adapting the way that they interview autistic people. So how might autism impact upon a person's ability to provide evidence? Well, interviews are formal social interactions which present numerous challenges for most people, but particularly autistic people, unless modifications are made for a more enabling environment. So these can include issues with things like language and communication, with a very literal interpretation of questions. So, you know, kind of things that neurotypical people will just ask all the time, like I'm just going to jog your memory, draw your own conclusions, or questions that are posed as statements and aren't obviously questions, such as Ben told you he was home all evening, that don't necessarily, if you interpret them literally, they don't really require a response. So these can all cause issues in a police interview, and also issues around receptive language as well, so understanding the questions and in some cases expressive language. And then social cognition is also required. So you've got to think about what the interviewer wants to know, what do they know already, how much do they need to know, what sort of details to tell and when to stop. So all of that's quite kind of demanding on social cognitive abilities. As is also quite burdensome on executive function. So this is holding lots of information sort of online, if you like. So for example, formulating an answer to a long-winded multiple part question will require kind of quite high demand on executive functions. Obviously, recalling a past event is a memory. It's an episodic memory, which I'm going to talk a bit more about in a moment. And we know this is an area that can be difficult for autistic people unless appropriate modifications are made. In a police interview, you're also recalling an event, and you need to do that in a way that kind of tells a narrative. It processes the relations among things that happened. It creates, it conveys gist. And coherence, and all of this needs to be kind of wrapped up to sort of tell a story that can be understood by somebody else. Metacognitive monitoring. So this is monitoring what you know, how well you know it, and deciding whether to report that detail or not. So if you're not sure of a detail, do you report it, do you not? So you've got these series of kind of online decision making, if you like, about trying to recall the memory, trying to judge how accurate it is, and then whether to recall it or not. So again, this is quite demanding for everybody, really. But we know that these can be particularly demanding for autistic people, particularly in these formal social interactions. And of course, it's a new environment and new situation. It's stressful. It's going to be a stressful situation for anybody, but particularly as well if there's sensory issues and issues around disruptions to routine and so forth. So, so all of this, as I said, is going to be stressful for anybody, but particularly most likely for an autistic person. So we therefore need to think about how we can modify interviews to make them less stressful, because that is good obviously for the person being interviewed, but it's also good in terms of achieving justice, because you're then going to get better evidence from that person and supporting all of these abilities. So just to talk a little bit more about memory first. There's now kind of fairly widely established difficulties in memory in autism, but they're very specific. So what we call semantic memory, so this is memory for general information, timeless facts, that's not specifically tied to a particular episode in time. So this might be kind of knowledge of capital cities or the name of your first teacher at school. Semantic memory is good in autism. It's the episodic memory where we find specific difficulties under certain circumstances. So episodic memory is recalling a past event. It's a co-occurrence of elements of an experience, such as the who, the what, the where, and the when. And these components need to be marked to then allow retrieval for this whole episode in one coherent bound unit. So this is recalling things like issues around when it happened, where it happened, who was there, why you were there, and any other kind of contextual details. And this is the part that can be difficult for autistic people. So their memories tend to be more general, so talking about sort of general facts from one's past, but without necessarily recalling kind of specific episodes with this past contextual detail. So we find kind of intact what we call item specific processing or memories. So remembering, for example, the who and the what, so the pieces of information, but not necessarily the whole episode. So you might remember that your colleague has moved department, they've got a new job, and you might remember what that job is and who the colleague is that's got it, but not necessarily where or when you learn that information. So there's this sort of difficulty in recalling all of the contextual information together in context as a whole coherent bound episode. And as a result, this can lead to what we call source monitoring difficulties. So remembering, as I said, the kind of the who's got the new job, what the new job is, but not where or when that piece of information was learned. Oh, it was actually when you were having a conversation by the water cooler 3 Tuesdays ago, just after lunch. That would be a whole kind of episodic memory. And of course, in the criminal justice system, we need to get that whole memory. We need to know the where and the when. We need to know all the other contextual information. So we need to find ways to support people to retrieve the whole event and not just individual pieces, although those individual pieces are still important. Importantly, though, autistic people can recall as much as non-autistic people from episodic memories if they are appropriately prompted. And the task support hypothesis, which was developed by my PhD supervisor, Dermot Bowler, a while back now, shows that, or posits that when you start providing more cues at retrieval for autistic people, such as cued recall, so rather than just saying what happened, you say, tell me what happened in the shop at this time, or there was an item on that word list that was a type of fruit. Then autistic people recall more. And when you give them recognition tests, so literally, did you see this at study time? You know, was this word there, or was that person there? That's a recognition test. Autistic people perform as well as non-autistic people. And we quite often see that with cued recall as well. The differences between autistic and non-autistic people tend to show on free recall tests, which is a really important finding because it suggests that the issue lies in retrieval, which is good because it means that we can then develop appropriate techniques that support autistic people to recall as much. So the memories are there, we just need to elicit them. So I'm going to talk now a bit about how effective current police interviewing procedures are for an autistic person. So the cognitive interview is one of the most widely researched police interviewing techniques. So it was developed by two American psychologists almost 30 years ago. And it's based on a number of psychological principles, one being context reinstatement. So this is that if the situation when you come to recall a memory, kind of the context around that matches as closely as possible the context of when you encoded it or when you watched the event, then you can recall more details. So a kind of classic, very old now, I think it was 1970s experiment, they gave deep sea divers lists of words to learn either underwater or on land. If they put them back in the same environment, either underwater or on land, to recall the list of words, they recalled more. So the cognitive interview uses a technique called context reinstatement to try and mentally travel back in time to the context that was experienced around the time of the event by following a series of verbal instructions from the interviewer to kind of recreate emotions, to recreate things like surrounding details. What was the weather like? Where were you? What did you do just before? You know, were you walking? Were you with somebody? And kind of recreating all of this contextual detail that leads up to the event, so that then when you actually come to recall the event, you can recall more detail. The cognitive interview also uses multiple and varied retrieval cues. So for example, this is based on the principle that you can access a single memory in a number of different ways. And actually when you try different retrieval routes in to access that memory, a person can recall more information. So for example, asking them to recall the same event backwards, or to imagine that they're looking down on the event now from a bird's eye perspective and to recall things again. Sometimes this can trigger additional memories. And also social communication techniques. So rather than just kind of coming into an interview and being like, right, what happened? Really building up a kind of bit of rapport with the witness first, what we call transferring control of the interview to the interviewee. So feeling like they can control the pace, that they don't have to kind of rush through it, that they could report as much information as they possibly can. So the cognitive interview has been widely shown to be really effective in increasing the number of details witnesses recall and making this detail more accurate for a wide range of witnesses, from typical adults to children, elderly witnesses as well. So one of the first things I wanted to do in my PhD was to look at how effective the cognitive interview was for autistic witnesses, because kind of at first glance, based on the task support hypothesis, that if you provide more cues for recall, autistic people can recall more information. You'd expect that it might be quite effective for them. But on the other hand, it's obviously very much it's very much relying on social communication techniques. It's relying on instructions given from an interviewer, for example, to travel back in time to mentally reinstate the context and so forth. And what we found was that the non-autistic group, we replicated the kind of really widely established findings that the cognitive interview increased the number of correct details they recalled compared to just a standard interview with the same number of retrieval attempts. But it didn't significantly increase the number of correct details that autistic witnesses recalled. So this is important because it's quite a time-consuming model of interviewing for very busy police officers to engage with. So if it's not effective, then it's kind of, at best, it's a waste of time. However, unfortunately, it also increased the number of incorrect details that autistic witnesses made. So not only was it not effective, it was actually detrimental because it increased the number of errors that were made, and that can obviously have negative implications for the investigation going down, wrong routes and so forth. So this basically showed that cognitive interview isn't appropriate for autistic witnesses and can actually make their recall worse than it would otherwise have been. So that's important practically, but it's also of interest from a theoretical perspective, because is this an encoding or retrieval issue? And we need to better understand what the issues are around a cognitive interview, because we need to develop alternative appropriate support for autistic witnesses when they recall information. So, for example, if context reinstatement would ever work, if autistic people are not recalling an event bound in contextual details, then any kind of context reinstatement procedure is going to be futile. So we looked at this with the self-administered interview, which is effectively a pen and paper format of the cognitive interview. So it was developed for scenarios where you've got a big event like a terrorism event or a road traffic collision or something, where you've got multiple witnesses, and police don't have time to prioritize them necessarily, and yet we know that memory for events declines with delay. So you want to get a good quality retrieval attempt early on, and then that can also help the police to then prioritize witnesses for follow-up interviewing. So the self-administered interview, as I said, includes cognitive interview techniques, including context reinstatement and the instruction to report all information, which is report all detail, no matter how small or trivial it may seem, which is a really important instruction. So we looked at the self-administered interview to see if context reinstatement, perhaps in a written form, would be effective for autistic witnesses. So this basically is a series of bullet points asking witnesses to sort of relax, mentally travel back in time, think about things like where they were, who they were with, what the weather was like, what the environment was like, and so forth. Importantly, it contains no social component. So we've taken out that social interaction element to see if maybe that was the problem. So when we look at the context reinstatement procedure within the self-administered interview, so this is the witness writes down their memories. As I said, there's no interviewer present. It's a kind of pen and paper booklet. We again found that it wasn't effective for autistic witnesses. It was for the non-autistic witnesses, but not for the autistic witnesses. So this is not really highlighting whether it's an encoding or retrieval issue, because we still found that the context reinstatement procedure is ineffective. But there's reasons to believe that it is a retrieval issue, rather than that autistic people simply aren't encoding an event with contextual information. So various reasons include the high burden of executive functions and working memory in these sorts of procedures. So asking a witness to report all information, no matter how small or trivial it may seem, may be really difficult, particularly for an autistic person, to try and gather, well, exactly what level do I need to go down to for that, and what type of detail, and that can kind of actually create quite a lot of burden with that instruction. It also relies on emotional imagination. So context reinstatement instructions often include things like the instruction to remember how you were feeling. And while studies in the lab with kind of using very basic stimuli show that autistic people often find it difficult to recall incidentally encoded contextual details, when you show them the contextual details that were there at the event, they can recognize them and say, yes, they were there. So the memory is there. It's just not necessarily being spontaneously recalled. And of course, while source monitoring, that's remembering where or when you learned something, can be often diminished in autism, the task support hypothesis, as I talked about, posits that autistic people can recall as much, including details about source, if appropriate cues are provided. So all of this suggests that it's more of a retrieval issue. So we wanted to test this still with this physical context reinstatement, still with the context reinstatement procedure, because it's one of the procedures that's really widely established in the typical literature as being a really effective procedure for improving eyewitness accounts. So we wanted to see if there was a way we could kind of elicit a benefit from a context reinstatement procedure. So we did this by witnesses in a mock eyewitness study. They record an event with context reinstatement instructions. So, from the interviewer saying, okay, I want you to close your eyes, think about what you did just before, leading up to the event, blah, blah, blah. But half of witnesses, we actually physically put them back in the same place in which they witnessed the event, whereas the other half of witnesses, we interviewed them in a separate room to see if actually physically being back in the context improves their accounts. And we found that, so you can see the blue bars are the usual verbal context reinstatement procedure, showing that the autistic group's recall was less complete than that of non-autistic witnesses. Whereas you can see the orange bars are when they're interviewed back in the same room. And now autistic witnesses are performing as well as non-autistic witnesses, and significantly better than when they're interviewed in a different room. So they can, autistic witnesses can benefit from context reinstatement, but it needs to be perhaps physical in nature, or at least not relying on a series of instructions, be it given verbally by an interviewer or in a pen and paper format. So that's positive, because it's showing that there is a technique that can be used. But obviously it's not often practical or desirable to return witnesses to the scene of a crime in order to recall something. There's a whole range of problems with that. So we need to find alternative methods of task support. The standard structure for witness interviewing in the UK and many other countries is rightly to start with free recall and then ask questions based on what the witness has already said. So this is really important in order to not contaminate a witness's account. So they've provided from the outset as much detail as they can, and then the interviewer can follow that up in questions, but only based on what the witness has already said. So this is the standard model. So free recall is the kind of gold standard, followed by open questioning. However, free recall is very problematic for autistic witnesses. We find it sometimes less complete. So there's less of it, there's less correct details. Quite often this relates to people and actions, unsurprisingly. Often it's less specific. So this is, for example, recalling a particular instance with contextual detail. So this is this real episodic memory. Sometimes it's less accurate, and this might be related to monitoring details around the who, the what, the where, and the when. Sometimes it can be less relevant as well, because there's no parameters around it. It's tell me absolutely everything, don't leave anything out. So this can be quite difficult to kind of gauge for various reasons to do with social cognition, executive functions, as I kind of outlined at the start, that can make accounts less coherent and kind of diminish the narrative elements of it. So free recall can be problematic. So we recently tested out some different methods for prompting autistic and non-autistic witnesses. So we compared open questions, so tell me about last time you went to the bank, with what we called semantic support, which was kind of priming a witness to think about a specific instance by first recalling a general information about that category of event. So for example, do you often go to the bank, or do you do your banking online? Versus asking a specific instance of when they've been to a bank. And then the visual verbal prompting, which is a technique where participants were prompted for all of the specific details that they needed to think about in their answers. So for example, tell me about the last time you went to the bank, tell me about when it happened, the people who were there, the actions that occurred, the setting, and the objects that were there. And then they get this this pie chart that you can see at the top of the screen there. So they say use this card to help you structure your answer. So the witness can use like a penny to kind of go around and just make sure they're covering all of those elements in their answer. And we looked at this across different types of questions for different types of contexts, such as healthcare, job interviews, and criminal justice system contexts. But I've just collapsed the data here across all of these contexts for simplicity. So the verbal visual prompting significantly increased the specificity of memories recalled by both autistic and non-autistic interviewees. So that is, compared to open questions and this semantic support technique, it elicited more detailed accounts that were rich in contextual information, which is obviously the sort of information that you want in the criminal justice system in recalling an event to provide evidence. And another study by a group at Cambridge, they looked at different question types with autistic children, ranging from very open, what they labeled them slightly different. They called them invitations. So this is a general cue with no restriction on focus. narrowing down a bit more to cued invitation that refocuses a witness's attention on something they previously mentioned and then uses that as a contextual cue. So for example, you mentioned that there were two men exchanging something, tell me about that. And then down to more specific directive questions that more closed, I suppose, like who drove the car, what colour was his coat. They're more closed questions. And then option posing prompts, so that's kind of yes, no questions, was the door open or closed? And they found that cued invitations were most effective for autistic witnesses. So this is, as I said, kind of refocusing the child's attention on something that they've already said, and just kind of narrowing the parameters a bit, which is what police interviewers should be doing anyway. So they should obtain, as I said, the free recall account first, which is the gold standard, and then following that up with specific cues that kind of probes for more information. The problem with that, though, is that you need to get the free recall first on which to base the questions. And the questions generally are problematic. You can't go straight in with a question because you have to, as I said, base it on what the witness has already said. Otherwise, it would be seen as leading, and it can also contaminate memory. Questions can also limit completeness. And also questions can be problematic, although we know in the lab that they can support episodic memory retrieval. Within a more applied settings, they can lead to increased compliance. So we know that autistic people may be more compliant to kind of going along with suggestions in certain circumstances. So what alternative techniques could be used? So I spent a lot of time studies showing what doesn't work, which was all very interesting, but not particularly useful to police, who kept asking, what can we do then? And I just kept telling them what they couldn't do. So it was nice to be able to kind of develop something that was effective in improving autistic people's retrieval, that was also legally compatible. So rather than just going straight in there with questions, actually, we developed this technique, which we called the witness aimed first account, or WAFA technique. So here, rather than the interviewer saying, okay, tell me absolutely everything, don't leave anything out, in the WAFA interview, it's still witness driven, but the witness is asked to generate their own discrete parameter bound topics of the event at the outset. So, okay, can you basically splitting the event into its component parts in brief? So for example, the interviewer might say, okay, can you tell me the most important thing that happened in the event? And they say, oh, yeah, there was two men having a fight. Okay, I'm just going to write that down, put it on a post-it note. We'll come back to that later. Okay, can you tell me something else that happened in the event? Oh yeah, there was a couple buying some stuff from a shop. Okay, so you write that down, and then you go forth until basically the witness indicates that that's kind of the main segments of what happened during that defined time period of which you're interested in. So the witness has kind of segmented the event up briefly, and then the interviewer can go in and ask them to freely recall absolutely everything they can remember within each of those parametered units. So for example, starting with the two men that had the fight, okay, you said that there was two men having a fight. Can you go into as much detail as you possibly can, tell me everything you can remember about that, don't leave anything out. So you're still giving this kind of report all instruction, and it's still free recall, but it's got the parameter, it's just about the fight, and then you can move on to the next topic, which might still be investigatively relevant. And it also makes it easier as well for police in some circumstances to sort of divide that up into what might be investigatively useful. And then their free recall within each of those units can also then be followed up with more sort of open questions from the interviewer. So, oh, you said he was wearing a coat, can you remember what colour it was, or describe his coat, and so forth. So we found that the WAFA interview increased the number of correct details recalled by both autistic and non-autistic witnesses compared to a control interview, which was an interview that was free recall followed by questions. Oops. And it also improved the accuracy of that information as well. So both autistic and non-autistic witnesses were more accurate with this WAFA interview and without it. So there are other techniques as well that can be used. So sketching is one of them, and this there's a sketching component of the self-administered interview where witnesses are asked to recall the event again, but to draw it, and they can annotate it, or they can write things down that come to mind as they're kind of sketching the event. We found that was effective for autistic and non-autistic witnesses. And also Michelle Mattison and colleagues have developed a variant of context reinstatement using sketching, where witnesses are asked to think about what will remind them of the event and kind of travel back in time to the event and sort of sketch that and describe what they can remember as they sketch. And they found that improved the accuracy of autistic witnesses' recall, but it didn't improve the number of details that they recalled. So it improved accuracy, but not completeness. But either way, it's still a benefit. So sketching could be used in certain situations. It obviously depends on the crime type and the dynamics of the interview and so forth as well. But that's also a potential technique that could be used. Another option, which needs further examination, is to potentially use more remote forms of interviewing to alleviate the social cognitive burden. And that's obviously particularly pertinent in the current times that we're in. So in this study, we looked at the trade-off between accuracy and informativeness. So it's not all about accuracy or completeness. There's actually a trade-off going between the two. So you have to, as a witness, you have to recall information that's as accurate as possible, but you also want to get it as detailed as possible. And you, as a witness, is always balancing that trade-off between the two things, because the more detailed you go, potentially the less accurate you might get as well. So we looked at this across 3 phases of questioning, varying the instructions that were given to witnesses. So we sometimes told them to maximise, in one phase we told them to maximise accuracy. So only report details if you're absolutely sure that they're accurate, over informativeness. And we also varied the conditions in which the questions were delivered. So some witnesses received them socially in a normal face-to-face interview format. Other witnesses received them online on the computer. Now, both autistic and non-autistic participants showed a tendency to prioritise informativeness at the expense of accuracy. So that is, all witnesses tended to report information at a finer grain of detail that was sort of had a bit of a trade-off with then making it less accurate. But both groups' accuracy improved with the instructions to maximise accuracy over informativeness. So that's important because it shows that instructions can improve things. And overall, accuracy also improved when questions were delivered socially for both groups, which was interesting in terms of the autistic group in particular. But we also found quite a subtle difference in the social condition when we looked at reporting control. So this is where we kind of did a more fine-grained analysis, looking at the trade-off between when someone decides to put forward a fine-grained response if it's inaccurate or accurate, or if they choose to put forward a coarser-grained response if they're less certain of the accuracy of that information. And we found this measure of reporting control was worse for the autistic group in the social condition, whereas in the online condition, they made more optimal reporting control decisions. So there might be something kind of slightly more subtle going on with online and social questioning, and it suggests that we definitely need more research to look at this further. But there was another study that looked at avatars and showed that they could potentially, again, it was kind of more of a subtle finding, potentially be beneficial. So maybe rather than just being social versus online, there might be ways of diminishing the kind of social intensity of a situation that frees up then cognitive resources to make these reporting control decisions and to more accurately recall information and optimize reporting. So that's a kind of bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the issues around, from a kind of empirical perspective, around memory and autism and interviewing, and some of the main findings there. So we've also been applying the findings, which is as important. It's not just, you don't just know about them, you actually got to put them into practice for them to be of benefit. And I've been really pleased to be working alongside Police Sergeant Adam O'Loughlin, who I don't think he'll mind me saying is autistic himself, and has been doing some amazing work to change police knowledge and practice, particularly at Avon and Somerset Police, which is where he's based, which is our local force, and helping us to translate the research to have real world impact. So we've been working together to develop some interviewing, some force-wide training for all officers in Avon and Somerset that's role specific. So it's not just, the problem is there's not a joined up approach for police training, and a lot of it tends to be just generic autism awareness, and actually what we need is role specific training. So if somebody works in first response, they need training about how to better work with an autistic person when they first respond to them, whereas if someone works in interviewing, or if someone's an interviewer, to train them up on actually interviewing issues, and likewise custody. I've also been working with the National Autistic Society on their guidance for criminal justice system professionals, and there's some revised guidance which is due out, I think, any day now, and as well as putting this into toolkits for advocates as well. So actually when you go into court, similar principles apply, although it's a very different questioning style, on how we can kind of alleviate the burden for autistic witnesses, and also in terms of policy. I just want to briefly say something about intermediaries. So an intermediary is a person who can facilitate communication between an interviewer and an interviewee if that interviewee is considered to be vulnerable. And they will complete a comprehensive communication assessment that focuses on the needs of the interviewee and advise the police interviewer about adapting communication and intervene as necessary. So the work that I've talked about has been very much based on kind of group differences, or, you know, as a whole entire group of autistic and non-autistic people, but we actually really need an individualized approach. And this is where an intermediary can come in and be really, really helpful. And they're best placed to advise on techniques for that individual witness. And also particularly as well for witnesses who have limited language or intellectual disability. So although we've developed new interviewing techniques such as the WAFA technique to better support autistic people to provide the best evidence, there are a number of remaining challenges. A reoccurring issue surrounds diagnosis disclosure, with the implication that adaptations are of limited value unless police know how often the person they're about to interview is autistic. So two key points to make here. First is that adaptations we find that help autistic people actually benefit non-autistic people anyway. So making these changes anyway would certainly do no harm. In our 2016 study surveying the autistic community, we found that many autistic people were reluctant to disclose their diagnosis to police. Obviously, diagnosis disclosure is a very personal choice, but it's usually necessary in a criminal justice system context in order to trigger adaptations and adjustments so that they wouldn't, so that they can receive appropriate support. So in a sense, we kind of need to encourage disclosure where possible, so that by reassuring autistic people that they wouldn't be discriminated against for doing so. So when we asked autistic people in our survey why they didn't disclose, they gave a variety of reasons, but often reasons relating to feeling like they would be discriminated, or that it would devalue their evidence, or that they would even be victimized by the police. So there was this kind of real feeling among a kind of subsection of people that it would have actually negative implications. So I just want to briefly say, go over a couple of studies that we've found, that we've run looking at the effect of disclosing one's diagnosis on other people's perceptions. So in this study, we looked at the impact of diagnosis disclosure on others' perceptions using videos from a previous eyewitness study. And we showed them to mock jurors in one of two conditions. Half of mock jurors were told that when witnesses were autistic and were given a bit of background information about what autism is and how it affects a person. The other half weren't told anything at all. So as far as they were, they didn't know that that person was autistic. And what we found was that providing diagnosis with further information significantly improved other people's perceptions of autistic people in terms of their credibility. So perhaps the differences that they may be seeing in behavioural differences and other cues, they think, well, that's because they're autistic and for no other reason. And this also applies to defendants. So in a vignette study, so this is a kind of a mock a written story, if you like, of a fictional account of something that happened. Participants were informed about a defendant, a Mr. Parsons, who was picked up by the police for behaving suspiciously at a train station. The police tried to restrain him. He lashed out, became violent, struck an officer. And then it describes his behaviour in the interview and in court. Display. So these were kind of what we did. We developed something based on kind of real life examples alongside diagnostic criteria. So this include aggressive behaviours that were reactive to high stress, invasion of personal space, disruption of routine, and so forth. We either told mock jurors that the defendant was autistic and provided them information about how that affected him, or we didn't tell them anything at all. And we found that those were provided with information about his diagnosis rated him as more honest, more likeable, and less blameworthy for his actions. And actually, even though it was quite clear in the vignette that he did strike an officer, they actually, if jurors received information about his autism, they actually were more likely to judge him as being not guilty for his actions. So that's quite, I mean, it's obviously a kind of a simulated scenario, written fictional scenario, but it does suggest that diagnosis disclosure in the context, these sorts of contexts within the criminal justice system can actually be, have a positive impact on other people's perceptions. I'm just aware I'm kind of running quite tight on time, so I'll just skip through the next slides quite quickly, but I just want to say that there is a whole other field that really needs to be looked at in relation to suspect interviews. So suspect interviews are designed to detect deception. So although on the one hand we want to elicit a detailed account of what actually happened, they're also, when it's believed the interviewee is being deceptive, they techniques can be employed that maximize cognitive load and task difficulty. And this can be done in the way that evidence is revealed strategically or tactically that can make it very difficult cognitively for an interviewee, and particularly, maybe particularly problematic for an autistic interviewee, particularly as well if they are being judged as being less, perhaps less credible if their diagnosis is not disclosed in the first instance. So this is a whole kind of big area that really needs to be looked at more, and I'm delighted to say that Ralph Bagnall, who's now going into second year of his PhD research, is looking at this area. So watch this space for more research by Ralph, because he's looking at a whole range of aspects in relation to suspect interviewing. So just to finish up nearly, the challenges remaining for this criminal justice system are thinking about flexible interviewing, so not just a one-size-fits-all approach, encouraging diagnosis disclosure where possible so that adaptations can be made. We need training, we need a joined up approach between different forces who all tend to kind of have their own approach to this. Highlighting the importance of registered intermediaries, which we also need for suspects as well, which is probably a whole nother talk, but intermediaries are really important. We need more research. Most of the research I've talked about has been with more verbally and intellectually able individuals, and we need more research with suspects, and also in relation to courtroom questioning. So just to finish, I just want to say that actually these principles kind of don't just apply to the criminal justice system. Narrowing the parameters and making the required response more explicit it can be important in a range of other settings, from employment interviews. So for example, rather than just saying, tell me a bit about yourself, the interview can be more specific and say, first, I'm going to ask you to give me a short introduction to yourself. What's your personal characteristics? What's your educational qualifications? And what work experience do you have? That benefits both autistic and non-autistic interviewees. Also in healthcare and other clinical settings as well, we might think about things like a version of the WAFA technique being used to kind of fragment the story or what is required in that setting. So I just want to end by saying that none of this work would have been possible without all of my amazing collaborators and colleagues who I've worked with on these projects over the years. And I also want to say a huge thank you to my funders. Thank you again to Autistica for inviting me to do this talk, and thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Katie. If you just unshare your screen. Perfect, thank you very much. And I will just welcome everyone back. So thank you, Katie. That was an absolutely fantastic talk and absolutely fascinating as well. So just a reminder to everyone who's online that you can submit your questions using the question and answer function on Zoom. And thank you to everyone who's contributed on the hashtag Autistica Festival on Twitter. Many of you have asked whether or not the presentation will be recorded. It will be, and it'll be on our YouTube channel later. Some other people have asked for research papers. The Twitter account, the Centre for Research in Autism and Education at UCL, they've actually been live tweeting your talk, Katie. So they've actually attached some of the papers which Katie has referred to out there. So hopefully that's quite useful. So thanks to everyone who have submitted questions. We'll try to get through as many as possible, but unfortunately we won't be able to get through them all. We've only got 15 minutes, but I'll just have a look. I've got them open on our screen here. I've got one here from Damien. He suggests here that he doesn't think that autistic people are context blind, but there's a mismatch of salience as to what is important within a context. So free recall is thus leading to confusion. What do you think your findings suggest about perceptions of context more broadly?
That's a really great point. I think that's one of the reasons why physically returning to the context is beneficial, whereas following these verbal instructions isn't, because the verbal instructions make assumptions about what would be important context for people. For example, the weather or what they did just before or whatever. It's almost too leading in a sense, and assuming that's an important contextual detail, which it is for neurotypical people, or seems to be at least, because it improves their recall. So there's other contexts. I think I think physically returning, the fact that does improve recall is really interesting, and it suggests there is something there, but it's what is it? We don't. Well, maybe that's for autistic people to answer. And it may be very different amongst autistic people as well. Like maybe it's very, very individual. Maybe there's a pattern there. I don't know. That would be a really interesting area to look at more, I think.
Great. Well, no, absolutely. Thank you very much. There's a question here about cued recall. So the person asks, are there difficulties with cued recall, such as, were you with someone being too close, being too close to leading questions? So this issue around leading questions. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so. I think that so when I had to kind of jam quite a lot into quite a short frame of time. So the cued recall I talked about more towards the beginning was in relation to the kind of very basic experimental work in the laboratory using things like word lists and pictures. So that would be cued recall in that sense would be like, can you recall the items of furniture that were on the list? So that's kind of cueing somebody to something. Whereas in the applied setting in a police interview, you'd want to cue someone in a less leading way. So if they've mentioned a fight between two men, describe the men. So that would be more of a cue, but it's not leading, and the kind of model for interviewing is to start very open, describe the men, and then they might talk about a jacket, and then describe the jacket, and then if they've still not said, you can then say what color was the jacket. So it's kind of going in that kind of format. Great.
So we've got another. So I'm just going to rush through these questions as quickly as we can. So I've got another question here from David, and David's quite concerned about the impact of police behaviour on autistic people, and so he asks, is there any evidence of mental health problems or suicides relating to people making inappropriate arrests of autistic people or inappropriate police behaviour?
That's a bit beyond my knowledge, a scope of knowledge, I think. I know certainly there are adverse incidents that do have really negative knock-on effects for autistic people. I couldn't talk about any specific cases in that, but there certainly are. but yeah, I don't think I can really sort of talk about that, because it is very kind of case specific as well.
Yeah, sure, I understand. So we've got a question here from Sophie. Now, you might need to give me and the viewers here a little bit of context here, because I'm just about understanding the question, but I think it looks like a good one. It's from Sophie, and she asks, "Hi." First of all, she says your talk was fascinating, and then asks, she has a question about context reinstatement. So if an autistic person gives evidence and then gives evidence again, is it likely that this would cause context reinstatement for what they said before and lead to repetition rather than accuracy?
That's a really good question. Repeated interviewing is quite a complex area in terms of what's happening when a person repeatedly retrieves an event, because on the one hand it's strengthening the memory trace, but on the other hand, if it's not a quality retrieval attempt to start with, so for example, if they're asked a leading question that produces an inaccurate response, then that can then become part of the memory, become a false memory for future recollective episodes. So I'm not sure if the question's asking as well about whether you should reinstate the context at which you previously recalled the event in, and that I wouldn't know about, but that's an interesting point.
Yeah, sure. So we've got some questions now about, you know, just the makeup of your sample, and obviously, you know, there's been really important rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I guess in that respect, we've had a couple of people asking about Black, Asian, minority, ethnic communities, how they're represented in research, and whether or not there's any research regarding Black autistic people or people from who are Asian or from minority ethnic groups, and whether or not there's any specific evidence around those groups and how they're represented in research.
Yeah, so this is been coming out more in recent years, actually before the Black Lives Matters movement, actually. For example, on Autism Journal, we now ask, or authors are now asked to provide more information about their sample, including information about ethnicity and so forth. So I think there is a move towards capturing that information better in research. In terms of how that would impact, ethnicity would impact performance in the sorts of studies that I've talked about today, there's certainly nothing that I know of that specifically looked at that. I know that in our samples, we have had a range of ethnic diversity, or participants from different ethnic backgrounds. We haven't specifically looked at how different techniques affect them, because we just wouldn't have the power to do that. I mean, there's obviously issues around if somebody is not British and has come from abroad, around language, that is a whole nother kind of research agenda altogether. But yeah, in terms of interviewing performance, then there's nothing that I can kind of think of. But in terms of treatment, which maybe is what the question was getting more at, that's not something that I'm aware of has been looked at, but it is a really important thing to look at.
Yeah, I think it's a massive gap for autism research across the board. There's a couple of questions here about how this research impacts differing groups. So maybe I'll split this into two. So there's one question on whether or not you've found any differences in respect of gender. So maybe we'll start there.
There is differences in terms of gender, widely established differences, just generally in terms of memory retrieval. We tend to try to match as much as possible autistic and non-autistic groups on first and foremost IQ. So then we know that any differences are to do with the diagnostic status and not IQ. Age, because that has implications for memory retrieval, and gender. Because of that, we tend to get more high ratio of males in our samples, so it makes it slightly more tricky to compare males and females. So we don't really have the power to kind of look in the studies that I've talked about today to look at sex differences, but there are more widely in the literature around memory, there are sex differences.
Great, that's really useful. So we've also had a question here around how this research relates to people who have autism and a learning disability. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Unfortunately, we are lacking in research on that. So I kind of rushed over the slides at the end just to make the point that the research that most of the research has been done is not looking at that sort of group. But that is something we really do need to look at more, because intellectual disability in itself has implications for providing evidence and the adaptations that people need, and also how they're perceived as well. And then when you throw autism into the mix with that as well, then there may be even more specific things that need to happen. I think, other than a need for research, I think the main point I want to make about that is that an intermediary would be really, really, really important here. So all witnesses who are autistic are eligible for an intermediary, but particularly a witness that also has intellectual disability, which would be potentially more obvious, and so they may probably more likely to get an intermediary as well, because they can then kind of conduct background assessments on that individual, guide the interview, and suggest individualized, tailored techniques for that person. Great,
thank you very much. So I've got another question here around basically this idea that some autistic people will have extremely good recall about certain factual events which may overwhelm the interview. Is there situations where the autistic person almost recalls too much information and it's then too difficult or time consuming for the interviewer to wade through?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's one of the problems. There are many reasons to do with why free recall is so problematic, but one of them is that actually you can get this kind of massive dump of loads of information, which then the person's cognitively knackered from having recalled information. The interviewer's kind of also burdened as well, because then they're kind of thinking, oh, trying to unpick all of that. And so actually it means you miss out on the important stuff. And there is a clip I sometimes show in talks from a BBC programme that was made a few years ago called Eyewitness. And they basically simulated an eyewitness scenario with a bunch of people who thought they're taking part in a different documentary programme. They went to the pub for lunch, they witnessed a mock fight or stabbing, I think it was, and then they were then taken through the police procedure. What they didn't realise is that one of these people had autism. And when they were interviewed using the cognitive interview, they show a clip of it. It's on, I think it's on YouTube, of them recalling literally the colour of the patterns on the carpet and so forth. It was so detailed, and the peas on their plate, which is great if it's forensically relevant, but it wasn't. And then you kind of run out of time, and like you say, the person's cognitively exhausted. So yeah, absolutely.
Great, that's a really great question. So there's one here about trauma and whether or not the trauma could be related to criminal incidents, which would be relevant to someone's recall. Is there any evidence on whether whether or not trauma has a specific effect on memory, which is different in autistic people from non-autistic people?
That is another great question, which we need research on. So no, we don't know that at the moment. But
great.
Very interesting, yeah.
Great. I'd like to apologise because my dog is barking in the background. Great. So I think I'm just going to look through see what the more questions. Do you have any? There's a lot of questions on mental health autism. Do we know how having co-occurring mental health problems has affected the results of your research? And so there's someone who's particularly interested in, for example, psychotic illnesses.
Okay, no, we don't. Not in these particular studies. We know, for example, that depression can or does reduce specific memory retrieval. So people, if they're depressed, will recall less specific instances from their past with less of that kind of rich detail. So they kind of tend to be overgeneralized memory, and yeah, so there's a whole bunch of implications for other co-occurring mental health problems. Great.
Thank you very much. So it's 11:45. and my dog keeps barking, and she's not going to go quiet anytime soon. So I think this is a good time to wrap things up. So thank you so much to everyone who's joined. If you want to find out more about what we're doing in autism research, please go to our website and join Discover. This is obviously an enormously challenging time for us and all research charities. We're really proud that we can put this event on for free, because we really believe it's important that we do what we can to make research available to all people. But if you do feel able to donate and to support us in any way, please do head to our website at autistica.org.uk/donate, and you can support us there. We'd really appreciate it if that's something that you can do. Finally, one last plug. We're doing an Autistica quiz this evening, and I'm going to be the quiz master. It's my debut as a quiz master, and I can't tell you how it's going to go, but we're really excited about it, and we're looking forward to doing that tonight. So that's at 7:30, I think, tonight. So just head along to our website and you can find out more there. And I know that Rebecca from Autistica is going to be posting information about all of those things in the link. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much to you all for joining. That was an absolutely fantastic start to our research festival, Katie. Thank you very much. That's a wonderful keynote, and I'll look forward to joining you all soon for the next sessions of our festival, which you can also find out more about at our website. Right. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye, and we'll speak to you soon. Perfect. Bye-bye.
Bye.